Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek podcast, where we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experience. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology. We'll be bringing you their perspectives on how digital transformation is reshaping the way we recruit, engage, and graduate learners. You'll hear firsthand accounts of how institutional leaders are developing their strategy, as well as get deeper on the stories of how these EdTech tools are being built to foster better student outcomes. With that, let's get to today's episode. Welcome back, everyone, to another super special live episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast, recorded here at DisruptED at ASU, put on by Collegiate Education. We are here with Nathan. You are fresh off your session. Things are happening like right outside the room here.
2 minutes ago.
Yeah, and so we'll bring a little bit of that magic in. The questions and things, the comments that you're getting from that session. Talking about kind of a lot of the same themes, but I also want to mention, if folks are watching on video, you might be wondering why there is a barbershop little spirally thing back there. What you can't see is this room, interestingly, is decorated like the whole space that we're in for this event, like a 50s diner, kind of old school retro thing. So it's kind of interesting. Just want to I realize it's just smack dab in the middle of the video if you're watching that.
I think
we know.
I think it's an entrepreneurship space, which seems appropriate for the theme. I mean, it's a lot of workspaces and just funky.
Yeah, it's a cool space. Yeah. Here on the ASU campus, the Sky Song, kind of a whole innovation center and, part of their campus and everything. So it's really great, and appreciate them for being good hosts for us and the whole event here. But we'll start out, if you want to just briefly introduce yourself and kind of your background, and then we'll get into really digging in, a great presentation around kind of enrollment declines, why that's happening, and digging in with some of the data. But before we get to all that, just briefly introduce yourself for our audience.
Yeah, I'm Nathan Grawe. I teach economics at Carleton College, where I've been since 1999. I'm a labor economist, so I've spent most of my research time thinking about how family background affects later outcomes in adulthood. I did spend 3 years as an administrator, and that sort of kicked me off into this area of research, thinking about, with declining numbers of kids being born, what might that mean for the demand for higher ed? So something between the view of an administrator and the view of a labor economist coming out.
Yeah, and I think it is this sort of like existential crisis for higher ed, the enrollment cliff and whatever. So I think it is like that idea of like, well, let's sit down and talk about it, and like, not have it be this sort of like boogeyman or something, the
right.
idea of like, it is at a certain point like economics and, supply and demand and all these sort of things. And like, I think that kind of grounds it, or sort of brings it back down to earth to then be like, so what are we going to do about it?
Right.
Like, it's not this sort of like, impending apocalyptic, thing or whatever. But just to make sure we're kind of starting with that baseline, because I was sort of peeking out and seeing some of your session, listening in, like, you're just kind of presenting a lot of, data and trends and stuff. So if you want to just give a snapshot of kind of the story so far with enrollment declines in higher ed. So like, what kind of has brought us to this moment here and now?
So if we go back to World War II through about 2010, the Great Recession, we just saw up and up and up in terms of post-secondary enrollments. There was never a 5-year period of down during that entire time period since the Great Recession, in part because the Great Recession pushed a bunch of people toward higher ed, and in part because of some other factors that we can talk about. We've seen a decline in enrollment, and this is disturbing in part because here in 2025, we're looking at the beginning of a contraction in the number of 18-year-olds reaching traditional college-going age. So in 2007, we reached a peak in the number of babies being born. Since then, we've seen a decline of about 17%. Kids get older 1 year at a time. So 18 years after 2007, 2025 is sort of the peak of that traditional age domestic market. And so, it's kind of unfortunate the matriculation rates have declined just as we're about to go into this period where we already know we've got challenges. So I think, you use the word existential. We throw the term around, an existential crisis, a lot. And often what we mean is, it was an unpleasant Friday or something like that. In this case, for some institutions, it truly will be an existential crisis. And it already has been with highly tuition-dependent institutions just saying we can't figure out how to make this work because we don't have the students.
Yeah, it's like that sort of just, again, practical piece of supply, demand, and all that. Yeah. And I think what's interesting is, there's already sort of this like downward trend happening, which then now is sort of exacerbated by the, demographic cliff and everything. And it's sort of forcing the point or kind of increasing kind of the urgency around like the need for disruption, change, adjustments, pivots, whatever you might call it. So it like, as the eternal optimist, like, this challenge presents a lot of opportunities, like it hopefully is sort of the fertile ground where like, or kind of the phoenix rising from the ashes, whatever kind of metaphor, like, that's where my mind goes. And then just, spaces like this, these sort of convenings are great to kind of be, generating those ideas and hopefully getting folks inspired. But I'm curious your perspective though, on like, it is that idea of like, there have been, challenges for several years since, 2007, 2008. And I think some institutions, you're kind of seeing, those smaller institutions are kind of, the ones more often than not that are struggling, closing, merging, all that. So like, I think it's just the idea of like, it's much more stark now, the winners and losers of like who was planning better ahead, making adjustments and investing earlier, and the folks that just didn't do it soon enough or didn't do it at all. Can you kind of talk about those dynamics? Like what were those things that were like really smart moves, a decade ago that are bearing fruit now that, other institutions, wish they would have done back then? Like just your perspective on like, what are those pieces of like what, strategy was kind of being deployed?
Yeah. So before talking about strategy, I'll just acknowledge that some of this was just bad luck for some institutions. So for instance, we've seen the decline in enrollments most pronounced is in the 2-year sector, where enrollments are off by more than 35%. If you're a 2-year institution, that's not your fault. But I would say that there are some strategic things, things that we tolerate that shouldn't be tolerated, and students eventually it catches up with you. So for instance, retention rates at many institutions are quite low. The national average at 4-year institutions is that about 3/4 of students will come back to that institution 9 months or a year later. So after 9 months, they throw in the towel. That's an alarmingly low retention rate. And of course, there are institutions who have 90% or higher retention rates, which means there are also institutions that are struggling to hit 50. Well, any business will tell you repeat business is where the real profits are at. If you insist on doing business one service at a time, you're just constantly having to recruit new clients. And so institutions that didn't figure out the importance of that repeat customer, of serving students well. I mean, it's a double-edged, it cuts you both ways. This student doesn't come back, so I don't get another year's worth of tuition from that student. But the word also gets out. Nobody is signing up for some college no degree, but load me on some college debt. That's not on anyone's wish list. And so when you establish a reputation of not taking care of students reaching their goals, then it makes it hard to recruit that next student as well. And so I think that's where we see some institutions, recognizing a little too late. You can expand access. I'm thinking of Iowa Wesleyan, for instance, that was here for a long time and then wasn't. And when you look at their enrollment data, you can kind of see they did start recruiting more students. They recognize our enrollments are a problem, but then they were recruiting students who were not necessarily as connected to the product they're selling. You can see retention rates suffer. Even in the documents where they're describing what would they do if they'd gotten bailed out, they note, we'll work on retention. So they can see it happening. They're just not fast enough to get over the line. And at some point you run out of money and you run out of runway. So, in those existential cases, I think often it's some pretty basic, customer support. You got to have satisfied customers to get repeat business.
Yeah. So that idea of like, it was a smart investment really building out like just a great sort of infrastructure, the tools, the platforms, the technology, the staff, and like all those sort of things. Cause that idea, it can be sort of a vicious cycle if you're struggling with retention or just like, positive student experience, that word of mouth spread, like, and you're just going to be kind of, dealing with that headwind a lot.
Yeah. It doesn't help be rural, for instance. And that for many institutions is something they can't do anything about. You want to have clarity of mission, though Green Mountain is a great example of an institution that everyone understood had a very clear mission. They had a particular niche, and that didn't save them. So, that's just a great reminder that, sure, have a clear mission, but implementation matters too. And, at some point, Green Mountain is also located in Vermont, which is ground zero for demographic collapse. So they had some things that weren't their fault dealt to them as well.
Yeah. And I guess the other piece with what you're talking about with like repeat customers certainly is just like positive student experience, good retention, good outcomes and all that. It also to me speaks to like just another trend that you've seen some institutions just do really well with is building out their digital education portfolio so that that can be kind of more accessible to more students, especially if they stopped out, they could be more accommodating for them to return. But then also just the other sort of certificates or non-degree stuff, whatever, they really kind of broadened their base and have these different opportunities for different revenue streams for passionate alumni to come back and kind of keep the sort of lifelong learning happening at that institution. I think that is sort of an element, and I think I do think that is a very compelling overriding philosophy that is sort of how the sort of winners that we're seeing right now, we're making decisions investing in either just the products that can allow for repeat business or just the idea of just really engaging people to sort of beget, sort of the good vibes, the good sort of brand awareness or whatever else. But
I think in those, you mentioned the digital tools. For some institutions, that's the right move. For some, it's the wrong move because you have to think about what is our mission, who is our student. But underneath that, I think those institutions demonstrated a willingness to actually talk to their students and prospective students to ask, what do you need? I think of Pam Ettinger at Bunker Hill Community College, who has been leading that institution in a transformation to become an adult-serving institution, because that's where the market is going. And she said they're looking at every single part of their operation through the eyes of an adult learner. She mentioned just one example that kind of drives home the point. They had an orientation process that required you to be physically on campus for 2 days before they'll accept your registration check. And she said, that makes sense if you're 18, I guess. And there's nothing, the 2 days, there's a lot of information that is really important information. She said, it's not like I'm criticizing the content that's being distributed, but it's not realistic if you've got a job and kids that you're going to physically be on campus for 2 days. We just have to look at this problem of orientation through the lens of the students we now are trying to serve and come up with new solutions. So whether that is hybrid teaching models or asynchronous learning, or it's very traditional learning, well, I think it could be either way. But if we're not willing to actually listen to our students and say, I hear you, the way that we have been offering this because that's what students in the past wanted, or that's what we as faculty and staff prefer, or that has to yield a little bit more to asking, what does the student need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where my brain was going too, is just sort of seeing what are the kind of examples of the folks that were kind of more proactive, with their strategy and all that. And then just continuing to explore the aspects of, what are the things that are sort of being borne out. And it is that institutions maybe are pivoting to, cater more to a certain population or, things like that. And I guess something else is I know that, I think it was I interviewed with the podcast Notre Dame Nemours University that I think is working with sort of the UC system foundation, something like that, to essentially enable them to go from a ground-based institution to a fully online, and that was just a big kind of cultural shift and all that. And, it was the idea of they wanted the physical campus to be preserved and sort of maintained and not just, plowed over to,
right.
do whatever with. So that was just a really interesting example. And I was really glad that I got to talk to her about that, because the idea is they're just recognizing we can still deliver on what is sort of a differentiated niche mission, leveraging all these great new amazing tools and things, and just do it now sort of outside of the bounds of a physical campus or something. So I don't know if you have sort of reflections on that or other things in that idea of, I think there's just many options for the ways that you can, double down on what it is that you do well and all that, and just kind of right size to really more fully kind of optimize or enable that. Or, is it that you try to expand or, going in more to digital education, but just your perspective on that thing of what are the tactics that are being born out of this moment that are enabling, institutions to at least kind of, potentially kind of survive and then hopefully thrive heading into the future.
Yeah, so it's really difficult to say this is the tactic, because with 4,000 institutions, we serve different students, we're different types. So I'm at a residential, highly selective liberal arts college. What's going to be right for us is completely different than Bunker Hill Community College. But I think we can identify, you mentioned culture, we can identify some prerequisites for success that will be true across institution types. So it's not that, hey, this is the program you need to add, but maybe more, this is the mentality or the culture you need to adopt. And this came up in in the conversation in the crowd today as well with the attendance, that we have to recognize, for instance, that the academy is a culture, but it is not the culture of the workplace. And so when we're working with workplace partners who are hiring our students, we need to think about how we translate our objectives to theirs. Like, how do we collaborate in a way that is productive for both, recognizing the cultural gap? We also have to think about the culture that we create with respect to the prospective students we're trying to reach. So I gave you the example of Drake that added a 2-year college associate's degree to the 4-year university. And I recognize it's a big cultural stretch. I mean, it might seem silly for people in non-academic industries. Like, are you kidding me? That's a big stretch. But it is a big identity stretch for many academics who have viewed themselves as, I teach at a 4-year institution. The notion of offering 2-year degrees is a cultural shift. And being willing to have the institution take on that cultural shift so that the students can just be who they are and find success at the institution is definitely going to be important. And the same thing can happen with technology. And I teach in person. My identity is wrapped up in the mode of teaching. And again here, so I'm at an institution where I'm privileged. I do get to teach in person. That is the primary mode. The thing we're selling is a residential experience. Mm-hmm. So we're leaning into this person-to-person contact. And I get that I'm very, very blessed to have the job I have, and others who might be forced to think about more technologically mediated teaching might wish they had my job. But I think while I can acknowledge that, okay, it's hard work to make this change, to come up with a new way of teaching, to teach with the technology in ways that meet students. It's nevertheless, it is the job. Students are hiring us for a purpose, and that purpose is to advance their goals, not to advance ours. And I'm not saying that faculty shouldn't think about what's good for faculty. Who else will? But at the root, we all know we got into this because we wanted to help students achieve their goals. And sometimes you get into the trenches and you're tired and it's week 8 and you've got a stack of papers to grade, and you can lose sight of the big picture of what we're trying to do here. And institutions that can create a culture that calls people back to whatever their student group is are much more likely to succeed than those that have an incoherent culture or a culture that's misaligned with where other students need them to be.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, because I think it, like you said, is like we kind of are embracing being the residential, in an institution, and, just offering that as like a different option and really trying to like do it well, the best and all that. Because I think it, it is that focus, I think, is really important from the institutional perspective. But and I guess like something else that I'm sort of like, that's kind of resonating is that idea of like, well, if you're making like a shift, that idea of like part of the change management piece, like one, just acknowledging that it is going to be a cultural change. And by doing so, hopefully like you are trying to provide good resources on, helping people to like learn, these platforms and tools, and give them the right support and guidance and that sort of thing. And so I think that's just like a thing that I kind of wanted to like circle and underline or whatever. But then like another piece of what you said of like, I think is something where like people are kind of acknowledging it and trying to kind of like nudge everybody away from it, is that idea of like so much around higher ed worked great for faculty and staff. Like for a very long time, it was all these sort of like bureaucratic or like just like ways of operating and, getting students enrolled and teaching them and credit hours and those sort of things. So like it's an acknowledgement of like, whether it's embedding a 2-year degree or other sort of credentials, certificates or whatever within like a 4-year degree or whatever else. It's just like recognizing that like we need to make our organization work better for the student, like just that being also kind of a big cultural shift. But like you said, like hopefully like there'd be kind of like a guiding North Star that'd be like, hey, we're doing this for the students. That's why we all got into this. So we've got to like, band together, and we will be of support to each other as we're like going on this journey. But I think that can always be a great sort of grounding foundation for like going through all this disruption.
And the way you described it, I think is right. That you said, look, there's a way that it's been done, and there were good reasons for that, but now things have changed. I think sometimes when we try to implement change, we don't acknowledge the value of what was for its purpose. There are a couple risks of that. One is we might, disrupt something that doesn't need disrupting. There can be unintended consequences. So understanding like why is the system the way it is a great first start. But the other reality is when people have done a thing a certain way and it's been successful, it's very difficult to make them change if you won't first acknowledge, I get why you're doing it. It actually makes a fair amount of sense. it's just not well aligned to the time period we're in now. Or alternatively, we think about registration holds that at some institutions have proliferated to the point where it's getting in the way of students re-registering. There was a lack of coordination. Like it makes sense why the library would want to put a hold because of that library fine. And it makes sense why the Res Life staff want to be able to put a hold for the hole in the wall. And it makes sense why, each of these individually makes sense, but the totality is if there are 50 different ways we can tell you cannot register, we're going to have an enrollment challenge. And so we need to have a more coherent collective. But acknowledging, as you did, that there's a reason things are the way they were is a great way to help bring along people who, in higher ed, we have a lot of people who've been at the institution for many decades, well, at least decades. And if you've been someplace for 20 years, you say, hey, look, this has actually worked pretty well, believe it or not. And there's a reason that we're doing it the way we're doing it. And so when change agents come in and want change, if we don't address that and acknowledge it, you can just lose them from the start. They're just stuck in he just doesn't understand why we do it this way.
Right.
So acknowledging it and say, I do understand why we do it this way, but we need to do something different is a way that I think is more productive to getting the conversation off to, as you said, the ultimate question, which is, but what's going to serve our students now best?
Yeah, because I think that's like a good way to go about things, because like there is instances where like just because it's different does not mean it's better.
Exactly.
Like some people there's the idea of like change is just like good by its very nature or whatever. Right. It's like not always, especially if like there's certain like traditions or different things. Like there's even things like that of like these campuses that have existed for, maybe hundreds of years or something. It's just like certain things are just sort of a tradition maybe or whatever. Like, so I think, that due diligence to like, empathize, understand and all that. And like, even just using that kind of, those like prior processes and stuff to kind of build upon where it's like, hey, you're actually going to do kind of the same thing, but just do it over here now because it helps your teammates and stuff. We're not like, so I think because it always is sort of a through line, and I really love it though. Like, in all these conversations around digital transformation and disruption and everything, it's like change management piece is just sort of like the X factor, like you could be like, we bought the best tool in market and whatever else. And
that's right.
It's like, it could just fall flat on its face.
It's been terrible.
Yeah. And the idea of knowing again, like there's an urgency of this moment, we're experiencing these enrollment, challenges, whatever else. So, with all that being said, we will end with our standard question here for our interviews on site. Just a final bits of advice for other leaders navigating this moment. Just advice to help motivate, inspire, help folks to navigate this moment.
Yeah, I would say that there's a need to somehow create a positive frame around change. It is stressful right now. We have a lot of different stresses coming at us, and so change fatigue is a real thing. If we experience only the negative sides of change, we're going to struggle to keep pace. Brian Rosenberg wrote in a recent book that most of our institutions, or at least higher ed itself, came out of a religious tradition. Like faculty became professors and people became staff at these institutions because they had some sort of missionary zeal that they were bringing. And he notes that while we don't have that same religious connection today, the missionary perspective actually does map pretty well. And so if as a change agent you can tap into that idealism that brings people to higher ed careers, then it's more possible to bring people to the point of excitement around change, that we're doing something of great, great value to transform lives. And that, brings people into accepting salaries that they might be able to find better elsewhere, but they're willing to do it because they really love the mission. And so figuring out how to frame change in that positive way of supporting students is a great place to start.
Yeah, I love that advice. And I think, I appreciate just sort of the nature of this conversation because like, I know you're getting into some of like the numbers and figures and trends and all that. And I, highly encourage folks if they're interested in all that to like, please do engage with you to kind of get that perspective. But I think it's like for this as a complement to what you shared
That's right.
earlier, it's kind of like, okay, so what? Like, how is that sort of impacting institutions? Like, well, some are doing this and finding success and others were trying stuff and it didn't work. And this is why, So I think that it is sort of like added sort of context and color around sort of like you kind of like setting the table stakes and kind of the story so far and all of that. And so this has been very enjoyable for me to kind of get into that, and even just there's little aspects of like history in there. As the history major for undergrad, I always love that. So just appreciate your time, all that you shared, and for being here as part of this event and joining me for this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.